The climb back to the pod took more out of Kael than the fight below had. By the time he hauled himself through the rear brace and onto the deck plating, his hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the memory lens. The amber chest light in his suit painted the curved walls in tired color, and the pod's own emergency strips answered with a weaker glow, as if the whole shelter were breathing through clenched teeth. "Status," he said, because saying something practical was easier than listening to the silence after victory. The pod answered at once, its voice flatter than before, stripped down to function. "Thermal reserves at 9%. Resistance lattice stable. Gate seal confirmed. External signal pressure reduced by 62%. Interior temperature decline ongoing." Not safe then, just less doomed. Echo came in behind him, larger body moving carefully through the narrowed brace passage, so its membrane fins didn't scrape the living ribs. The child slipped past Kael's leg and went straight to the warmest place in the room, a shallow fold near the fabricator wall, where the pod's skin still held a little trapped heat. It curled there, pale blue scales dimming, and for the first time since he had met it, it looked simply young. Kael crouched beside it. "Hey, stay with me." 4 small cyan eyes blinked up at him. The child lifted one hand and pressed it weakly to his wrist. Not fear, reassurance. It was trying to comfort him. That hurt more than if it had cried. Echo lowered itself on the opposite side of the nest fold, tail rings pulsing a low, tired blue. One broad head fin tilted toward the child, then toward Kael, guarding both, asking without sound what came next. Kael looked around the pod as if the answer might be growing out of the walls. The new rear module had settled into a rough shape while they were below. Brace ribs thickened with black glass veins, ladder anchored deeper, floor stronger underfoot. Resistance mode had changed the pod's growth. It no longer felt hungry. It felt stubborn, like a wound learning to scar over. He set the smoky memory lens on the fold-out shelf beneath the cracked viewport and unstrapped the signal insulation bracelet from his forearm. A thread of smoke still leaked from the humming stone socket. The thing had held longer than it should have. It had also nearly cooked his skin through the suit. "Can you repair this?" he asked. "Insufficient fabrication heat," the pod said. "Alternative. Biological resonance stabilization if compatible specimens cooperate." Kael let out a dry laugh. "Of course that's what you'd say." Echo's ears, if the flexible fin ridges counted as ears, lifted at the sound. Kael rubbed his face with both hands and felt grit, dried blood, and the ache of too many hours spent deciding things no one should have to decide alone. Then he looked at Echo again and knew that part was no longer true. He opened the emergency locker and took inventory because inventory was control, and control kept panic from becoming useless. 1 heat cell, 2 ration bricks, meltwater at 30%, medical foam half spent, tether remnants. The silence hook, no spare filters, no miracle tucked behind the bulkhead. "Pod," he said, "if I burn the last heat cell, what do I buy?" Projected 8 hours of livable temperature for current occupants. 12 if 2 occupants enter metabolic torpor. Kael's eyes went to the child, then to Echo. "No." Echo made a low sound in its throat, not quite a growl, not quite agreement, but close enough. He paced once across the narrow cabin and back. Outside the cracked viewport, violet snow dragged across the black glass plane in fine sheets. The tower stood far off now, dim and inert, but not dead. Nothing on this moon ever seemed fully dead. It only waited in a different posture. His chest light flickered. At the same moment, something answered from beneath the floor. Kael froze. It came again, a soft, deliberate knock from somewhere under the ladder well. 3 taps, spaced like thought instead of mechanics. Echo's head snapped toward the sound. The child uncurled so fast it nearly fell from the heated fold, all 4 eyes suddenly bright. The pod waited half a second too long before speaking. "Alert! Structural shift detected in sealed sublayer." Kael was already moving for the silence hook. "That's not a structural shift." Another 3 taps sounded below them, clearer now, and then, through the deck plating, a voice he knew was not the duplicate and not the pod whispered in a language the memory lens had taught his bones to almost remember. The whisper came again, thin as breath through frost, and Kael dropped to one knee beside the ladder well before the pod could dress it up as another harmless warning. He pressed his palm to the plating. Cold bit through the torn sleeve and into bone. Beneath the metal, something answered with 3 slow taps, then a pause, then one. Echo moved in close, body low, fins spread just enough to shield the child. The little one leaned forward instead of hiding, one pale hand flattening to the deck beside Kael's. At once the faint script under the plating bled up through the seams like trapped moonlight. "Pod," Kael said, already reaching for the memory lens, "show me what's under this well." A beat of silence. Then sealed sublayer intersects resistance brace. Cutting access may reduce thermal retention by 19%. So there is something there. Confirmed. Kael let out a humorless breath. You keep waiting to tell me things until they become expensive. He set the lens against the deck. Smoke gray light feathered across the metal, and the plating became briefly transparent to his eyes. Below the ladder shaft, tucked into the new growth the pod had knitted around the old guardian chamber, was a narrow cavity no bigger than a coffin. Not a room, a pocket. In it sat a knot of old black glass conduit wrapped around something organic and still alive enough to move. The child made a small sharp sound. Echo answered with a low vibrating hum that Kael felt more than heard. "It's trapped in the brace," he murmured. The pod grew around it. The whisper came once more, and this time the lens carried meaning with it. Not words exactly. Pattern. Warning. The same instinctive understanding he'd felt at the gate slid into place. Pressure, flow, hunger, stop. He looked up at the white ribs of the module. The new brace that had saved them was also choking something below. If he opened the deck, heat would bleed out. If he left it sealed, whatever was under there might die. And if it was part of the Guardian network, they might lose more than a life. "Thermal reserves," he asked. 11%. 1 heat cell left. Confirmed. He hated how calm the pod sounded while it described a slow, freezing death. Kael sat back on his heels and forced himself not to move too quickly. Guesswork got people killed. He unhooked the silence hook from his belt and laid it across the deck. The cracked guardian stone in its head gave a tired pulse. Then he touched the repaired humming stone the child had helped restore, setting it beside the first. Echo watched his hands with all 4 glowing eyes. The child crept closer until its shoulder rested against his leg. "Okay," Kael said softly, more to steady himself than them. "We test before we cut." He tapped the silence hook against the plating. The whisper below vanished. He lifted it and the tapping returned immediately, faster now, urgent. He set the humming stone down alone. The deck warmed by a fraction and the script brightened, but the tapping turned weak and irregular. Then he placed both tools together, stone against hook, and the entire ladder well gave a single resonant thrum. The pod's ribs shivered. A seam he had never noticed unfolded in the floor, thin as a knife line. The pod spoke at once. New interaction detected. Guardian harmonic offsets resistance lattice draw. Kael stared at the opening seam. "Say that like a person." A pause. "If correctly tuned, Guardian biosignals can support resistance mode with less thermal loss." He looked at Echo, then at the child pressed against him, an understanding hit with a force that made him feel briefly sick. The pod had always grown by consuming. Resistance, though, resistance could be fed another way. Not by meat, not by salvage alone, but by living cooperation the machine had never been built to value. The first real rule, earned instead of given. Echo lowered its head and, without being asked, touched the humming stone with its snout. The child put both hands on the deck. The seam widened another finger's breadth, and warm air sighed up from below carrying the bitter mineral smell of old glass and something alive under strain. "Cost?" Kael asked. The pod answered immediately this time. "Sustained harmonic support will exhaust guardian organisms if overused." Of course it would. Kael swallowed. then reached for the manual release buried under the seam as the tapping beneath them turned frantic enough to shake the frost loose from the rails. Kael jammed his fingers into the manual release and pulled until the old catch bit skin off his knuckles. The seam fought him for one stubborn second, then gave with a crack that rolled through the brace like a shot. A slab of black glass plating dropped inward, and something small and pale blue threw itself through the gap hard enough to hit his chest and send him back against the ladder rail. The child guardian clung there, trembling, four bright eyes wide and unfocused. Echo made a sound Kael had never heard before, too raw to be a growl, and folded its fins around the smaller creature so fast it looked like one body trying to become two again. Then the tower answered the noise. A pulse ran through the buried lines under their feet, sharp enough for Kael to feel in his teeth. The pod lights flickered amber to blood red. From beyond the cracked viewport came the scrape of glass limbs on ice. "Contact," the pod said, too calm. Multiple watchers converging on exterior hull, signal insulation falling below safe threshold. Kael pushed himself upright with the child still half tangled against him. Up close he could see where the little creature's scales had been rubbed raw by the chamber seal. It smelled of cold stone and fear. Echo pressed its snout to the child's throat once, then swung its head toward the hatch, all four eyes narrowed. "Yeah," Kael muttered. "I see them too." The duplicate's voice slid through the weakened quiet, no longer a distant pressure but a breath behind his ear. "Open the gate again. Feed the seed and they stand down." Kael grabbed the silence hook from the wall rack and clipped the cracked insulation bracelet over his left wrist. Smoke threaded from the fracture immediately. Bad sign. No better option. "Pod, route every spare line into the rear brace. Keep the chamber sealed behind us. Doing so will reduce heating by 17%. We freeze later." He slapped the interior hatch. Frost-burned metal groaned aside and the first watcher drove through the gap before it was halfway open, all black prongs and jointed limbs, a shard of the tower given hunger. Kael barely got the hook up in time. It struck the crescent head with a burst of deadened vibration that sent the thing skidding sideways into the ladder. Echo hit it before it could recover. Midnight blue muscle and translucent fins crashed into black glass. The watcher's forelimb punched through Echo's shoulder membrane. Cyan blood sprayed across the white deck. Echo did not cry out. It only locked its jaws down and twisted until the limb snapped free like brittle ice. Two more impacts hammered the hull. Kael dropped to one knee beside the child. "Can you hear the lines?" he asked. The small creature stared at him, panting. Then it pressed both little hands to the deck and hummed. The sound went through the pod instead of into the air. Kael felt it in the rails, in the brace, in the cracked lens hanging against his chest. A buried path lit in his head at once. Not memory this time, but structure. A maintenance conduit under the pod's rear module. A dead zone where the old Guardians had once cut signal flow by collapsing a support spine. Terrain, weak point, choice. Echo. Back. Echo leapt clear just as Kael rammed the silence hook into the deck seam the child had found. The bracelet discharged through his arm, a white-hot spike that made his hand go numb to the elbow. The hook screamed against old metal. Beneath them, something vast answered with a crack like a glacier splitting. The rear brace dropped half a meter. One watcher outside lost purchase and vanished under falling glass. Another slammed against the shifted hull, trapped between two folding ribs as the pod's living metal clenched by reflex. But the jolt tore open the crack in the insulation bracelet. A ribbon of black smoke curled up and the duplicate came flooding in, triumphant and furious all at once. "There you are." Kael staggered, vision doubling. For one sick instant he saw not the pod but a ring of buried seed vaults opening across the violet ice, and standing among them, far off on a ridge of black glass, a tall watcher unlike the others had turned its faceted head straight toward him, as if it had seen through the trick, through the seal, through him. The child's hum broke into panic. Echo barreled back to Kael's side, blood dark on its scales, while the hull boomed again under fresh impacts and the pod's voice snapped over the rising noise. New hostile signature identified. Exterior tower witness active. Structural cascade continuing in rear conduit. Kael, choose now, hold the collapse or run. Kael did not think. He slammed the memory lens into the cradle at his wrist, grabbed the child under one arm, and drove his shoulder into the rear hatch release. Hold it, he barked at the pod. Seal around us. Echo with me. Amber light snapped red. Living metal ribs thrust out of the wall, not fast enough to repair, only fast enough to brace, and the floor dropped half a handspan under Kael's boots as something larger than a watcher hit the hull again. Echo spun, membranes flaring wide, and threw its weight beneath a buckling seam where black frost already spidered through the inner skin. The pod's voice came strained and thin. Manual stabilization possible in rear conduit. Probability of injury, severe. Better than freezing in the tunnel. Kael shoved the child toward the ladder alcove. The little creature caught itself, looked back once with all four pale eyes wide, then planted both hands on the wall and began to hum. The sound was small, frightened, and exact. The shaking changed. Not less violent but patterned, as if the child had found the rhythm of the failure and named it. Echo's head snapped toward the hum. It understood before Kael did. Its cyan eyes fixed on him, urgent, commanding. The conduit, Kael said and ran. The rear module was half-grown and half-wounded, a rib cage of white charcoal plating around the buried chamber they had claimed from the ice. One support had folded inward. Beyond it, the resistance lattice glowed in ragged bands, every pulse slower than the last. Between the ribs, Kael saw movement outside. A tall, shard-limbed shape dragging itself over the pod's spine, not one of the small watchers but something assembled from the same logic and more patience. Tower witness, he thought, and the word landed with a weight his recovered memories hated. He dropped to his knees at the split conduit. Heat bled from it in weak gusts. The line did not carry fuel. It carried decision. The pod's new resistance mode had no stable path through the expanded brace, and the tower witness was forcing surges back into the hull, trying to make the pod choose growth again. Tell me how to lock it, Kael said. Locking will divert all remaining thermal reserve to local integrity and sever external adaptive intake. He stared at the sparking seam. In plain language, no more scavenged growth without manual reconfiguration. No emergency bloom, no fast healing. Current shelter capacity may become permanent. The pod almost never sounded uncertain. Pilot authority required. This choice cannot be reversed with existing resources. Behind him came a crack like a glacier splitting. Echo cried out, not in words but in pain. Kael looked back. The larger creature still held the seam, scales scored and bleeding where the living metal had cut into its shoulders. The child's hum had gone rough with effort. They were spending themselves to give him seconds. And suddenly he knew what the old guardians had really paid for when they became rememberers. Not victory. Limits. If he locked the conduit, the pod would stop acting like a seed pretending to be a home. It would be home, wounded and finite and theirs. No easy expansion. No hungering machine making choices for him. No taking salvage and flesh in exchange for miracles. Just walls they would have to maintain, heat they would have to earn, and every future room bought slowly. It would also mean responsibility with no excuse left in it. Kael put his hand into the split. Pain climbed his arm as the conduit read him. The memory lens flared amber, then a deeper color beneath it, old and stern. Script unfolded across the torn housing and wrapped his wrist like frost writing itself from the inside out. Rememberer authority recognized, the pod said. Confirm final resistance binding. A fresh impact hit. The whole module lurched. Outside, something shrieked over metal. Kael met Echo's gaze across the failing room. Echo bared its teeth, dug in harder, and held. The child's hum steadied again, trembling but true. Kael closed his hand and said, "Bind it." The conduit snapped shut around his wrist like a jaw, and the pod screamed through every wall at once. The scream ran out through the brace and into the buried chamber. Not sound alone, but pressure, command, refusal. Kael felt it in his teeth and wrist and the old scar at the base of his neck, as if some lock buried in him had finally slammed shut. The amber chest light on his suit flashed once, then steadied. Around them, the living ribs of the pod stopped flexing with their old hungry rhythm and held fast in a new pattern, a hard, woven lattice that looked less like growth than a creature bracing for winter. Then the duplicate laughed. It came through the floor, through the wall skin, through the key biting Kael's arm. Not strong, not winning, just alive enough to enjoy what it had learned. You sealed one gate. Kael tore his wrist free from the conduit and staggered back. Blood beaded where the housing had cinched down, but the script burned there too, dimly silver now, as if written beneath his skin. Report. Resistance binding confirmed, the pod said, voice flatter than before, almost exhausted. Primary seat expansion pathways locked, external draw denied, internal hunger protocols suspended, thermal reserves at 7%. A crash hit from outside the hull. Echo whipped around with a snarl, head fins spreading wide. The child pressed against Kael's leg, all four pale eyes bright with alarm, humming under its breath in quick pulses that made the floor markings flicker. Another impact followed, lower this time, metal groaning under it. "Watchers?" Kael asked. Echo gave a sharp chuff, but the child made a different sound, thin and urgent. It slipped free, darted to the rear ladder, then stopped and looked back hard enough that even Kael could read it. Not out. Down. The wall beside the ladder shimmered. A seam opened in the new brace module that had not been there a minute ago, revealing a narrow cavity lined with old black glass and fresh white pod tissue. The duplicate's voice slid in again, softer now, more intimate. The tower was never the gate. The tower was the lock. Kael went still. The memory lens, hanging from its cord against his chest, had begun to warm. Not the harsh pulse it gave when waking a buried record. This was steadier, directional, like a compass finding north. Outside, something scraped across the cracked viewport with enough force to send a spidering tick through old damage. Echo crouched to leap toward the hatch, ready to meet whatever came through. No, Kael caught one of Echo's shoulder fins with his good hand. If they're still moving after the bind, then the bind changed something else. The pod answered before he could frame the thought. Correction. Sealed pathways no longer accepting command from local seed structures. Residual autonomous defenses remain active. New signal source detected below. Magnitude increasing. Below, the child insisted, striking one small hand against the opening. The guardian hum rose in its throat until the script on Kael's wrist answered with a faint ache. Echo looked from the hatch to the child, torn, then made its choice and moved to the opening instead, tail rings blazing cyan in the dim room. Kael snatched the silence hook from its mount, clipped the memory lens to his belt, and checked the single remaining heat cell. One charge, maybe less in this cold. Pod, if we go down, can you hold the hatch? Temporarily. Temporarily how long? The pod waited half a beat too long. Unknown. Another impact. This time the outer hatch buckled inward with a shriek. White frost burst through the seam, and with it came a thread of black dust that moved against the air like it was smelling for them. Echo lunged in front of the child. Kael shoved them both toward the opening. Down, now. He dropped after them into the dark as the hatch behind him began to tear, and something on the other side answered the pod's scream with one of its own, deeper, older, and waking fast.